Hello everyone, today we talk about 10th century Catalonia between the Western Frankish monarchy, I would say within the Western Frankish kingdom, technically, even though as we will learn here there is a speedy process of practical, of de facto independence, right, achieved by the Catalonians, the papacy, and the caliphate of Cordoba, right? These are the three figures that Catalonia basically, jostrates, if this is a term, if this is a verb in English, to joust, right? Jousted itself between, to gain fundamentally an important degree of autonomy. This is not the first video I make on, nor on Catalonian history, as you know, I made some videos already, medieval Catalonia, but I think I addressed this period in Catalonian history directionally, like if anything between the 9th and the 11th century. So this is a very delicate moment, not just for this mark, but for Europe, for Western Christendom, and that coming to that formation, let's say, coming to being of a truly, the revival, let's say, of an imperial universal order, which would see, especially in the second half of the 10th and beginning of the 11th century, Catalonia as fully part of, and as one of the most, if not the most westernized land in the Iberian Peninsula, if we understand Western as Frankish, right, or post-Carolingian in some way, not only, right, but that was the hegemonic culture that would come to encompass wide areas of Europe that were yet to be formally conquered by post-Carolingian rulers, namely, in fact, England, Sicily, but these other countries that might not being conquered, right, by the Franks, like, I don't know, Hungary or Spain as a whole, still were heavily, right, Francicized. And the case of the Christian powers in the northern Iberian Peninsula is definitely one of this incredibly gradual but very founded and relentless coming back that we call Reconquista, and at this time had to be defined at a level that was not just, in fact, dichotomically Christians versus Muslims, but really in a process of local affirmation, right? That could not pass, as we'll see now, also through the presence of the same caliphate of Cordoba, at least as a medium, as an incentive of some sort. The picture that, as you know, right, we're looking at during the 10th century is the one of great crisis and contraction of the Western Empire. The actual Roman Empire in the West would be a better definition. You have essentially the Carolingian dynasty that has collapsed. You have basically no other functional emperor capable of bringing together yet even a substantial part of, we're talking about the first half of the 10th century, a region, like it could be Gaul, Germany, or Italy, under a single ruler, so that there were emperors technically, and the thing never ended, nor anybody thought it would be possible. But this surely was centuries of consequence with all the various Viking, Magyar, and Saracen raids that all came around these places. Sooner or later, even the Magyars reached northern Spain. They crossed into Catalonia at some point as well. So that is how wild the not much the collapse of the internal strength really was, but the fragmentation of the same. So that all these polities forming as feudal seigneuries from within previous Carolingian or Romano-Germanic districts were trying, in fact, to consolidate from, and at the expense, of course, of the broader picture. Catalonia was a mark of the Western Frankish kingdom. Right? Today, talking about the 10th century, we analyze how basically that separation came to being. Actually, the French would try later on to regain control, even up to very late in time, this territories in virtue of this former Carolingian accomplishment of compacting under a military frontier district the Catalonian lands with the counties, etc. And this stemmed, of course, from the crisis of the Western Frankish kingdom that was, in insight at the time, the one that seemed the least capable of actually reviving itself in a politically unitary way, right? Burgundy, the Eastern Frankish kingdom, the Italic kingdom, all looked like more compact than Western Frankish power. As we've actually ascertained, or just this is not something I have to do, like to convince anyone. This is scholarly recognized. Instead, there was a major force within the Western Frankish kingdom that is in part proportional to the degree of fragmentation. And that paradoxically, just like the vassalitic beneficiary system, feudalism if you prefer later on, would have that agglutinating sort of capacity of reviving a more compact monarchy. It would take centuries, right? But this was the moment of greatest fragmentation. And the Catalan counties were just from the other side, also the Western Frankish center of power, that, as you know, was located in the north. Paris and the areas in the northeast of it, mostly, well, what had been the Merovingian and Carolingian power base, heartland, all right? And therefore, there was all Occitania in the south that, as we will see now, and we've seen in another, but there is a parallel video that I will list in the top fixed comment down below about 10th century Occitania that also addresses Catalonian issues, because it has to do with that. It actually shows, that's interesting throughout the rest of the 10th century. We will not look at in particular detail now, but it would actually bring the Catalonians, once they had accomplished a great part of their autonomy, to actually be more sympathetic to the Western Frankish, say the connection with the Western Frankish ruler, than the southern, say than Occitania, the Aquitanians, let's put it in this way, given that they were so distant that they were not worried particularly, and on the contrary, by this monarchy, that on the contrary could provide them with an important degree of formal official recognition in the local politics and institution. The major power that actually concerned the Catalans at this point was the Islamic one of Cordoba, that at this time is actually reaching the peak of power before the collapse in the later part of the century, the beginning of the 11th. I made videos on, for example, the Paris system, how this also early interaction that we'll see in part later now of, in this case, the Catalan countess was with the Caliphate. Here we are probably in the northeasternmost Iberian territories, so the ones that, of course, were very distant from Cordoba herself. So that's why Catalonian history is so fascinating, because it's really in between so many different influences that they could play right on this decentralized location that would not be enough, right? Especially from the Islamic side, to spare the land from severe damage due to invasions and general strategic threat. The most evident aspect is also the fact that the Catalonian counties at this point were not really, let's say, capable of defending themselves simply alone. They could enjoy, yes, this decentralized position. They were autonomous in some ways, as practically any power at the time, but they were not a major power. They didn't have a regional deterrent capacity. They were necessarily under either one ruler or another of the bigger forces were agitating the Frankish power, post-Carolingian powers, the caliphal ones. And Cordoba was closer in many ways, and for different reasons. For example, because of the sea, right? The post-Carolingian kingdoms were not particularly seafaring. At this point in the Mediterranean, the Arabs still had the upper hand. Something was beginning to change with the Italians that would eventually help the same Reconquista along the Iberian coastline on the eastern part of the country, so the Mediterranean coastland. And so Catalonia would have a lot to do with that. But in fact, the Cordobans had a navy, and they could blockade and attack the same Barcelona, that was already, let's say, the most prominent port in Catalonia. There is also a general sense in the scholarship about the mark that Catalonia really opened for the first time to the world as a sort of country on its own, as would become later, like also during the High Middle Ages, in fact, with Barcelona, the Mediterranean, the establishment of an Aragonese crown, Mediterranean dominion, etc. Exactly at this point, in the mid-10th century. Lots of things were changing at this point. There was a general revival of the West. Catalonia belongs to this dynamic as well, both in the particular Christian Muslim ratio in the Iberian Peninsula, but also for the rest of, as we've seen, this post-Carolingian heartland. And one major connection that Catalonia had with the latter was the one with Rome. Right? This is crucial to understand. The Catalonians at this point began to seek papal protection, and especially so for in the place of the lost monarchic authority in the region. So in other words, the decline of the Western Frankish monarchy brought Catalonia to connect itself not much with the next, again, Western Frankish ruler, or even before Carolingian emperor, and this had importance also to define what kind of the Catalonian institutional mission from within the empire, interestingly enough, would have been. Naturally, we know that these are the years in which what we call the Holy Roman Empire, so namely the Eastern Frankish and Italic connection, would look like. But remember that at this point the empire is truly universal. It's always universal, and technically up to the previous century, there had even been a Western Frankish king who was a Roman emperor, talking about Charles the Bold, after the extinction of the Italic house, right, that had been the one from which the Carolingians ruled also imperially, right, in spite the heartland of Frankish manpower being in Neustria, in Austrasia, in the north. So the papal connection is to be framed within the quite complex and difficult relations that the Iberian churches had with the Roman papacy. Remember that the Visigoths had developed their own liturgy. Right, they were thinking of themselves as another Rome, another Constantinople, especially the latter, and they didn't really care very much. I mean, still an age was dominated mostly by the idea that it's the council to be superior to the single, even to he who has the primate of charity, like the Roman bishop. It was mostly a political thing, like Rome was already from 6th, 7th century, the spirit, it had always been, right, but in a truly ecclesiastical way, the true spiritual center of the Western world, the deep connection with the rest of Italy, with Gaul, the Merovingians, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Celtic fringe even, and beyond, the evangelization of Germany, etc. Well, this attitude had changed from the Iberian side when the Muslims had destroyed the Visigothic kingdom, and the northern Christian states were desperate to receive any form of support at that point from basically a just from Rome, from the broader, again, connection that already it existed, that happened actually in Longobards time still, but eventually with the connection with the Carolingians, etc. And the definition, in fact, of a different world, that boundary that we were saying before, existing between the post-Carolingian world, and in this case, in the Iberian Peninsula, the one ruled by first the Emirate and then the Caliphate of Cordoba, that had a truly universal aim, as you know, within Islam, but also and obviously in competition with the Western Empire. And I made really multiple videos about this. We will keep covering Cordovan history. That must be done also for the historical region series. In any case, the Sands was receiving monetary and military help from the West, and this began, like even the Carolingian invasion of Muslim Spain, that actually met also with a lot of resistance from the same Christians in many circumstances. The famous route of Roncesvalles being apparently it was actually a mixed force of Arabs and Basques, right? But I made a video about Gascony. We'll talk about it briefly, even in today's video. But it's obvious that, first of all, Catalonia, as we had maintained, is in fact, a more Western profile, being exactly the mark that had been created by the Carolingians for strategic purposes. Catalonia, as we will see now, was also different a bit from the rest of the Iberian Peninsula, at least what we call the Visigothic heartland. In a politically centralized, concentrated sense would be the Meseta highland, but the actual Gothic legacy in the broader, post-Visigothic world was actually much stronger in places not just like Catalonia, but even Occitania to some degree. Think about Gothia/Septimania. So complicated but important implications to understand also, say, the relations with France. Why did the Occitanians in many ways consider themselves still part of a broader southern culture that had more in common to some extent with Spain than, of course, the Frankish north, but was not even quite Spanish. In fact, Catalonia being quite, say, Mediterranean country and a Pyrenean one, that in this sense shared only partially the history of the rest of the peninsula, even after it was reconquered by the Christians, and having naturally lots of competition with the other Iberian powers. This opening to the world in mid-10th century is relevant also because Catalonia is ever more connected with the rest of the Mediterranean. As we were saying before, the Italians especially are establishing sort of greater connections with this Christian community, frontier community of the other side. That's where the first, say, crusades, we can't call them, in this way, not much dividing them from the ones that would happen later, but with the actual universal principle of Catholic struggle that had always been existing, telling the truth, and blessed by the religious authorities, as it's unavoidable, of course, by moral and scientific necessity, to say the least. It was bringing Catalonia very much closer to the Italian peninsula and the papacy. That was that hell of, this is not a blasphemous way, it's just an expression of, again, of authority, of universal and ever more aware, power within itself, right? I made a video about Schwerpunkt that is an Occitanian that would, in Rome, and Sylvester II a bit later from this, truly confer through its enormous culture, matured also thanks to the proximity to Islamic Spain, all the sciences that came from there, at the decline of the Ottonian Empire, actually to confer to the same Roman Church that true universal clarity and centrality that would be the same germ of the later Reformations, etc. So it's how important these lands really are, because one like Catalonia was just in between all these movements and mechanisms. Catalonia sought papal protection to replace what the Western Frankish monarch could not longer give. And this is fascinating because in theory, at least the monarch could send his divisions, right? The Pope would not have really his own division, if not, during the First Crusade. So to use a contemporary metaphor. But this was perfectly fine for the Catalans, because what they wanted to obtain from the Pope were privileges for their foundations. It would essentially substitute the old royal diplomata, right? And this was evidently important for ecclesiastical possessions. For example, by the year 1000, the great Catalan abbeys were under the direct authority of Rome. This is incredibly important because Spain, until the Catholic Series Catholicos of the end of the Middle Ages, would actually maintain an incredible autonomy in ecclesiastical affairs. And especially, again, the continental, the Castilian side of the story is really a thing on its own. Catalonia had instead this very early affinity with Rome that accepted in many ways also the ecclesiastical subjection to the same in exchange for this these privileges, the confirmation of the same. And given that the great Catalan abbeys were mostly founded by the lay nobility, the latter would follow in many ways. In other words, and this is not to be given really for granted, even though we're talking about the same families, that again they would exchange royal diplomata for papal privileges, also for their own, again, lay position. This is fascinating because, in a sense, the Pope was interfering with lay business in the Western Frankish kingdom. But what was the Western Frankish kingdom at this point, right? As early as 951, the Catalan Count Sunifred of Cerdagne went to the same urbs with the Bishop of Urgell. So these were some very important lords, right, of the land. And on the basis of this almost Missi Dominici couple style, right, such joint voyages became commonplace, reflect in this sense on the centrality of Rome. Right, the western half of the Roman Empire had been fallen from a half of a millennium, and definitely the spiritual power of Rome had never even appeared to be fading at any moment. The popes were naturally well satisfied by this deal because they would further, get extended their power. They would increase their earnings through the tithes, etc. There's a document of 956 that states, quote, "The Pope of Rome and the kings of the Franks, princes of our region," which is to say that we haven't forgotten that we're part of the Western Frankish kingdom. The Western Frankish monarch is our ruler, but we will report in this document that before him, it's actually the Roman Pope that really rules on Catalonia. And this is extraordinary. The papacy was constantly asked, by the way, to intervene in the affairs of the Catalan Church for obvious administrative reasons that would follow from the state of affair. And it's also through the papacy that the Catalan counts were reached in a very, unstraight geographical circle with the Ottonians. It may seem strange to you, but we will see this for the princes of the Western Frankish kingdom. But it wasn't so normal to be that connected with the Ottonians. Right. In 970, the Catalan Count Borrell met with Otto I. In 998 and 1001, Ermengel of Urgell met with Otto III. These are very important meetings, taking place in Rome, and essentially connecting Ottonian power, mostly based in the Eastern Frankish kingdom and in the northern part of it, so way more distant, of course, than the Western Frankish king, to be, however, more readily connected with the Catalan counties than the same Western Frankish king would do. Right, may seem mind-blowing, but that's also the sort of Mediterranean power of affairs, especially after the decline of the Saracen bases, base of Fraxinetum in Provence. This, again, initial maritime sweeping that the Italian maritime republics really do of the Saracen piracy. So, of course, the Germanic emperors were trying to rule from Rome, which would have been, of course, the single most advantageous thing of all throughout the entire Middle Ages and beyond. Also because what kind of Roman emperors would have they been otherwise? And rediscovering this Mediterranean space as a whole, as far as especially the Western Christendom was concerned, and that post-Carolingian territories, namely part of the older legacy, would be part of. This is, again, quite relevant. There is a Catalan identity that is consolidating on the basis of these issues. First of all, there is a broader, say, dynastic tendency, right? There is a single ruler of Catalonia that, say, is emerging over the counties as a, say, at least functionally speaking, as the ruler of the old mark. There's this intense awareness of the Gothic inheritance that was a way, as we were pointing out before, to essentially distinguish these lands both from the Iberian continental ones and but also the Frankish ones, ethnically, and definitely a common language, right? The nobility of Catalonia and Septimania were that connected, and they share this sense of being Goths, right? Not quite in the way truly maybe the nobility of the attending the Toledan councils would have thought that the Visigoths had been, but still, right, in that context, which served to autonomize further this region in between all these empires, right? Western Frankish kingdom de facto was an empire, was destined to become an empire, right? The French monarchy was fundamentally always an empire. You have the Ottonian one, you have even the empire of the church in a spiritual sense, you have the caliphate in Spain. Catalonia is truly carving out, together with Septimania, this outer space, something that in many ways the same Count of Toulouse would do. Think about the time of the Albigensian Crusade, also the Aragonese crown intervention to sort of salvage them, because this centrifugal forces could work better, paradoxically, even when tying themselves to all these other rulers. The papacy, think here. Borel, that we mentioned before, increased such solidarity with the, say, across the Pyrenees through marriage alliances. He himself married Ledgard of Rouergue and then Emeraude of Auvergne. These areas were quite fragmented. They would never provide with a particularly concentrated power. They were continental. They were also sort of separated importantly from, say, the main Mediterranean routes. That they were essentially dominated by monastic foundations in many ways. But that was the reason, in part, why they tried to sort of consolidate their shelter through this connections, and allowing the Catalans to, after all, being part of something that would preserve the autonomy of all involved. The Catalan counts and great nobles also made numerous grants to Aquitanian churches that, as we have seen, were quite powerful. mostly conquer le pays Saint-Martial, and especially La Grasse. This is always the same reason. It's the participation in the original ferments of Reformation we will see now, properly for the organization of a monastic net that could sustain further the same lay powers, right? As we hinted at before, however, there was not much that the Catalan counts could do themselves in a political and military sense to avoid, especially the ingerence of the Cordoban Caliphate. In 940, in fact, the Muslims blockaded Barcelona. At this point, the local ruler Sunyer was forced to sign a peace which basically made the Catalan counties a Cordoban client state. In 950, Borrell's embassy essentially renewed this treaty. There were 3 further embassies in 966, 971, and 974. And these were, let's say, there was something that the two sides were negotiating, but in practice, it was the Cordobans who benefited the most from it. Catalonia became ever more dependent on the Caliphate. This was part just of the normal, again, universal claim on all of Spain, right? We have been talking of different titles in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. Just recently made a video about Aethelstan named Rex Totius Britanniae, which also echoes Agilulf's Rex Totius Italiae. Gratia Dei, by the way, so truly the Holy Spirit, and so a truly imperial concept. Well, the Caliphate surely had made its own the geographical concept that Iberia, in spite of its enormity and internal diversity, was all one, right? That was the universe, a world on its own, which is correct in so many ways to conceive culturally, except especially for these northeastern territories that were definitely more projected and sort of borderline and overlapping with the Western Empire in practice as a whole, as a post-Carolingian reality. That, as we've seen, was not both in a Frankish sense. These guys thought of themselves like gods, but that's the kind of political equilibrism that the Catalonians were doing. By the way, the Arab expeditions, as we've seen, were quite far-ranging, right? Septimania had not really been free, Provence had not been free of Islamic presence. Poitiers didn't really stop, the Muslims journeying in southern Gaul, which was, by the way, allowed just by the local powers that were trying, in fact, to escape the Frankish imperial control. Why did the Catalonians accept this dependence on the Caliphate? Well, essentially to avoid being obliterated by the Caliphate, right? There was no other actual point in this. There was some material advantage coming from this. Still, again, the Muslims by this age had the upper hand on the trade balance, right, between the Mediterranean and Europe. In other words, their markets were still more florid than the Christian ones. Things would have changed as the tensions between, in fact, within Iberia, between the Christian north and the Caliphate would witness in the last decades, right, of the 10th century. But there is also, especially for merchant communities, like trade oriented on a long range of Barcelona, etc., to make this thing work, to after all still make a decentralized state sort of capable of gaining more wealth over time, not severing that access to riches that made it dependent on Cordoba, but only to some extent, right? and considered that the Western Franks had not stopped asking Catalonia for wealth, right? But the preference for the Cordobans from the latter side had to do with something that was really useful in when relations were normalized in this way. In fact, the Cordobans would provide to the Catalonians manpower, cloth, manuscripts, and above all, gold. Right. This is something that in a few generations the northern Christians in Iberia would have gone to seize on their own when the caliphate disgregated in the Taifas. But these are the years of the great Al-Mansur, right? Essentially the Cordoban chancellor and regent, right, for the local caliph that, as you know, launched a major work of a reconquest of the north, right, to subjugate the Catalans. The same Santiago was conquered at some point, made multiple videos about the Asturias, Leon, etc. And in 985, you had properly had this holy war, this jihad launched against all the Christian kingdoms of Iberia. This entailed an important political break in trust, especially with the Muslims, as we've seen. The Catalans had spontaneously, let's say, at least they had decided to subject themselves to the caliphate without complications. They had something to earn in the meanwhile, but say Al-Mansur's campaign had really overwhelmed the it was so universally comprehensive that Catalonia's demands could be fundamentally neglected. Al-Mansur besieged the same Barcelona on July the 1st, 985, and on Monday, July the 6th, the city was stormed and burned by Islamic forces. Right, the inhabitants were massacred or deported. This was also from, of course, the Cordobans that were aware of this sort of, not betrayal, sort of rejection of a Christian autonomy of some sort. And as we've seen, there had been retaliatory means. Barcelona had been at some point blockaded by the Muslims already. Of course, the latter were importantly benefiting from these raids, from these destructions. They were centralized. They were, through these damages, hoping to essentially drive more these guys into their orbit by sheer, say, impoverishment. Even though these campaigns were in many ways contingent, right? And it was even said historiographically that the sack of Barcelona of 985, that is pretty late in time if you think about that, and it tells you how actual powerful the caliphate was still, the quasi end of itself, and how sudden, in fact, the collapse that brought to the sort of golden age of the Reconquista really was, and how motivated by revenge, by hatred, the Christians really were in the north. That this event would mark the beginning of a sort of Catalan national history. It's an interesting question posed. It's a matter of interpretation. Indeed, the Catalan counties had historically their own sense of unity before that, but yes, you have to evolve at some point in history from just a set of counties created also through impositive means by the Carolingians on this land that was already, as we've seen, significantly something different on its own, but at that point getting a formal political institutional profile. And now these events, the Matus of Still is trying to, essentially managing to agglutinate the various counties further to a common goal, right? It's after the sack of Barcelona in 985 that the local count turned once again to the Western Frankish kingdom. This was essentially unsuccessful. There was a Catalan embassy sent to Compiègne in northeastern France, one of the important residences of the Western Frankish rulers. We are at the beginning of 986 to King Lothar, and there wasn't much that would come of it, simply because the latter died, and also his son Louis V ruled quite briefly as well. In other words, the Western Franks were not in the conditions to mount any expedition, especially that far away. All right, and that is an interesting scenario, because there may have been a different political balance in the Western Frankish kingdom if that had been carried out, right? So Borel would renew, aware of this temporary weakness of the Western Franks, the request for support against the Muslims just after Hugh Capet came to power. At least we do not have a direct evidence of the embassy, just what Gerbert of Aurillac, the future Sylvester II, would write in the king's name at the end of summer 987. And in this letter is written that Hugh Capet was promising a support to the Catalans on condition that their leader Borel undertook to meet the Western Frankish king in Aquitaine to do homage to him. Right? This is really not liked by the Catalans, that wouldn't answer further. As we were saying before, the Catalans would actually maintain sort of greater connection with the Western Frankish kings than the Occitanians at large would do, because they were mostly closer to the former. In the beginning of 988, Al-Mansur, that by the way had maintained the control of Barcelona, that's why the situation was so tense, where the Western Frankish sources should have been sent against. Hugh Capet was bogged down in his campaign against the rebel Charles of Lorraine, and the whole situation was therefore basically completely distant from any Catalan scenario to be altered by Frankish forces. The Muslims basically just could move away without actually being pressured by anyone, right? In the meanwhile, the same Catalans, together with many subjects of the Western Frankish kingdom, especially in Occitania, had refused to acknowledge the election of Hugh Capet. Right? There is this sense that we will see Hugh Capet's rise to power was sort of very, conflictual, controversial, and there is a malicious statement in the documents of the time that is, he who reigned in Francia, in the sources said, was nothing but a former duke, right, and not really a king. Right? In Latin, it's qui dux fuit pridem. And this is actually a moment in history in which not just Catalonia, but a bit like the southern half of France basically distances itself further from the north. Right? May seem strange, but up to this point, actually, there had been sort of a greater awareness, let's say, of the Western Frankish kingdom institutionally, in part because of the second invasions, the need to of support. In fact, from a central authority, this is what the Catalonians had tried to receive, even though it was not very realistic, telling the truth. This represents a watershed for the same Catalonian history. Right? They got betrayed by the Caliphate. They got abandoned by their lawful ruler in the Western Frankish kingdom. So also the notion of the latter still being a political reality, especially south of the Pyrenees, something that medieval at this point ends, right, historically, in spite of, again, the later French claims. By the way, the French, as you know, in the 13th century tried to conquer the region, but they failed anyway, so that's the point where they bail out, and aside from other times in history that they tried to, eventually fighting with Spain, etc., it was not on that basis anymore. But historically it had ended much before, and again, these lands had historically been, ethnically been different, right? The same Carpathians recognized this as they sent no more diplomats south of the Pyrenees. There are also no references to royal decrees in Catalonian documents anymore, as we've seen that up to this point, in spite of the preeminence of the papacy as a more concrete force that could not intervene militarily, paradoxically it was that powerful spiritually, still the name of the Western Frankish ruler was lawfully respected. Catalonian notaries that are quantitatively present differently from southern Gaul, because Catalonia was more Romanized, was more urbanized. You have more these figures. We have more documents. I explained it in a video about the southern Western Frankish kingdom and the problems about areas like Aquitaine broadly meant. We do not know too much, right? Still dated, however, documents by Frankish regnal years, right? So they maintained the chronology of the years based on the kings, but the memory of the king as such, as a political reality, disappeared, right? This is really fascinating, and in 1988, so 1,000 years after the Muslims abandoned Barcelona, the Catalans celebrated the event as probably the beginning of the country's political independence. Naturally, it's not a very relevant thing, telling the truth, as at the time it didn't seem like that, but it's important historically, aside from the political reasons, say, of later centuries, etc., to how these events are instrumentalized, but say to appreciate that was an important watershed of some sort. And this entailed, in particular, as always, defining a political territorial reality that by now was just evidently on its own, also from a military point of view. And so, given that the Caliphate, as we have seen, was the one that could walk into Catalonia, and getting out of it because they couldn't stay forever was too far, right? But the necessity of thinking the country, the people, as within a frontier properly, would shape, right, the governance of the Catalan counts in the following generations. All right. It's interesting that the Catalans revered, however, still the idea that they had an imperial mandate to fight against the Muslims. In fact, the only ruler they refer to at this point was Louis de Pius. You wonder why that? Well, he had been a Frankish ruler, right, of an entire empire, however, the entire Carolingian Empire. He was an important religious figure, Benedict of Aniane made a video about him, was also a Goth that really participated in quite the monastic reform of the Carolingian Empire, to say the least. It was a sort of second Benedict, and that was a source of pride for the Catalans that just right now, as we will see better in a while, we're defining properly a more developed monastic organization. And the Catalans stuck also to the sense of the Gothic legacy for their lands, if you want, in an ethno-linguistic way, or to stay identify the origin into that, which is not ironic, but at least it's meaningful when you realize that these were actually the single most Romanized parts of the former Visigothic kingdom. So what is Visigothic here is including actually some of the most strongly Roman identities in the entire Mediterranean in the High Middle Ages. And so being Goth there was belonging to at least what had remained of the Visigothic kingdom after the first waves of Islamic conquest, and the fact that actually those lands had always been rebelling from the Visigoths, a bit like they were doing from the Caliphate at this point back in the day, and the Ebro Valley was always very complicated to maintain by the Visigoths. We must make more videos about the Visigoths. Also, the Catalans retained the concept of dwelling within a mark, right? The Catalan counts were not particularly thrilled about the idea of a central authority, but the Mentus Hostilis that we have seen against the Saracens obliged them to recognize a sort of central authority of the administration. All this, however, was shifting towards an effort, a concerted effort against, in fact, the Muslims. The frontier, right, the disputed land. It's impossible to draw precise boundaries for a 10th century map, politically. You would have a series of fortresses, local peasants that were installing them, as we will see, with particular migrations also from the mountains, and having to cope with this frontier scenario, the raiding warfare, etc. You have also a lot of lawlessness, right? Brigands, renegades were happier in the frontier, like at all times, than in others. You couldn't quite even understand there who was whom in terms of allegiance politically, robber barons, common criminals, mercenary bands coming from very far away places, right? Already at this point, we're a lot, northern Frankish mercenaries, but also, Christian troops in the service of the Muslims that were fighting against the Christian Catalans, things like that. Or this Catalan nobleman, actually, this would increase over time, had always been there, telling the truth, serving within the Caliphate of Cordoba, and very often doing so already in a proto-predatory form, meaning that often the Caliphate had to quell some rebellions within itself, and at that point the Catalans would descend as if, they would have just been come to plunder the enemy lands, which was what they would have kept doing against the Taifas later on, after all. So that's also the reason why Catalonia was closer to the Caliphate than basically any other power. The Catalans saw this, also thanks to the fact that the Caliphate would be disgregating anyway later, as a sort of revive liberty of some sort. They thought that if they invested more in this violent dimension against the northern Caliphate, the Caliphate northern frontier, they would have essentially kept investing something that they would consider on the longer term profitable, right? And the frontier has its own identity, as you know. Throughout the 10th century, the Catalan frontier wouldn't even expand itself more than much. It was rather the country to be a frontier, right? If you look at the boundaries, you see a Christian advance just a few dozen miles south of Llobregat. There was no, say, particular sense of commitment for universal values. Like, it's not that it was truly a imperial, right, or religious motivation behind that. Of course, the Catalan counts were traditional aristocracy. They knew what they were fighting for. It was largely their own fortune in that sense. Yes, still within a universal struggle, but their individual existences would, however, point at very practical and local bargains that they were making, sometimes at the cost of their life, but still objectively in a profitable way overall. Right? The frontier, just like with war itself, would enhance some forms of cultural and commercial exchange with faraway places. But it's obvious that, in spite of the violence, the same Christian and Arab worlds were, as we were saying in the beginning, quite in contact through this land. Right? Catalonia was the easier route terrestrially from the Caliphate to the broader Western world. Right? So you can't quite unsee all the traffics that for centuries would always remain in a peaceful sense, but from faraway places, from England, from Lombardy, people were starting to go autonomously in Toledo before and after the Christian conquest, just to find manuscripts that they were already educated to know that they were there, right, against the very sort of passive, allegedly, passive reception of, say, Greek, Arab, and Jewish manuscripts by the Westerners that actually were already more educated than the average, let's say, person in the Islamic world, and that were, quite also more entrepreneurial in this sense, intellectually as well. So this is also what began to shape the same investments and the formation of some principalities provided more or less with ducal power. This is valid not just in Catalonia, not necessarily even just with the frontier with the Islamic world. For example, the province of Bordeaux, if you look at Gaul on the Atlantic, this, at this time was split between the principalities of Aquitaine and Gascony. Right, and the dukes jointly designated the metropolitan bishop. And again, I made a video both about Aquitaine and Gascony. If you're interested, you can look at that. This is a time in history in which also properly the political frontier between the Occitanian world and the Languedoc is established to some sense, because it didn't completely overlap the Loire, right? Bordeaux would quite be important, as you know, later for Guyenne, etc. But Bourges was actually emerging with in the north, right, in a much more French-exposed environment as the true center of Aquitaine, right? And as you know, this is the Duchy of Aquitaine, something very precise, as opposed to the dominion of the Aquitanian dukes that would accumulate other territories elsewhere. But you have at this point feudalism that is really mounting up and fragmented further certain areas, especially if this sort of post-Romano-Germanic world had not known yet the same intense degree of feudalization that the Carolingians had, especially in fact in the north, east of Gaul. And so it's at this point that many districts are literally redrawn on the map. There was bishop of the Gascons created that reflected the necessity of all these various principalities, duchies, to have their own provincial dimension. That's why, of course, Gascony also reinforced its own identity. This is a similar pattern that happens in these various territories. We will see it also from the Kingdom of Navarre. Everything is compacted at this point. There is a feudal statal model that is about to emerge, right? These are very timid beginnings, but they would objectively, as a pattern, follow what the later development would be. There was an emancipation, a desire in Catalonia as well, as far as the ecclesiastical administration was concerned, with the restoration of a native metropolis at Vic in 971. And for a few months after the murder of the new Archbishop Atto on August the 22nd the same year, this Catalan province was even detached from the metropolitic see of Narbonne that had been historically, in fact, the most relevant in this sort of Gothic province. And so this tells you also how, of course, the differences across the Pyrenees were actually marked, right? There were some Catalan counties that were also, say, across the Pyrenees, but in a cultural sense, you may split hair on, what was, the various, say, the degree, right, of Catalan identity, where, etc. Much was in theory, but indeed the Gallic and the Iberian world had been importantly different. Let's say this connection between these areas was mostly due to the fact that, aside from the Pyrenees, that's basically the only corridor that will always have some sort of strategic relevance that can afford to, especially in this importantly located, also rich, urbanized areas. Like there are other passes across the Pyrenees, also in the north, in the Basque countries. But again, Catalonia was one of the most Romanized and urbanized areas in the Western world, right? Even compared to the Iberian Peninsula as a whole, just perhaps the south, Cordoba, etc., where could surpass that. But it to never underestimate what existed before. Also, let's not overestimate, naturally, the economical power of this land, because Septimania and Catalonia as a whole, as we've just said, were a bit different. But especially Catalonia had not developed yet its maritime potential that would peak in the 13th century, right? And you could say that this lack of regional overlordship that would bring order, would start uniforming, homogenizing the administration, etc., sort of allowed this feudal potential in the land to essentially recolonize its territory, right? Many lands there were recognized as essentially wastelands. In other words, fiscal reserves that were, however, open to colonization, and that would be, say, remaining this way throughout the 10th century. There was, in this part of Europe, no Frankish immigration, all right, nor an immigration from other post-Carolingian areas. Largely, on the contrary, the colonists, the settlers, were established by the Christian Hispani. This was considered gods, but de facto there were, in many cases, mountain folks of the Pyrenees that, just like as we've seen in Aragon, in Navarre, etc., were just through the process of Reconquista, in that case against the Islamic side, and also on this side, but within also within the same lands, came to repopulate the lowlands, right? This was caused also by these disruptive events, like the conquest of Barcelona by Al-Mansur that we documented. So these are not being particularly tranquil areas in general. And so whenever there was an invasion, a major destruction, we're talking about 10th century economy, it's not yet booming like in the following century, and it was coming from early medieval centuries of, say, timid growth. So resources were not that plenty of, in spite of being a fairly developed area. Some areas were okay, while others needed manpower. Right? The interesting aspect is that the settlers coming from the mountain were the same force that fueled the Reconquista. Right? They had been saturating. It was at this point a re-expansion of demographics in Europe. That was the beginning of the boom of the later centuries. Or at least, it's something that starts becoming more consistent by scale. And these troops, as wild, sort of more primitive as they were, they could enlisted in the various bands by the various Catalan lords to go push further south against the Ottomans. Right. The settlement, for example, attested in Septimania as early as Charles the Great's reign, had actually started in Catalonia in the last decades of the 9th century. And in some instances, these peasants had moved on the road. Right, public authorities and abbeys were just, down in the valleys, and so they sort of received these people. They were able, as we've seen, to co-opt them, to channel them at least into manpower, labor force, etc., and aggrandizing this local institution's power. You have the exploitation of the Vic and Bages, plains. In 897, you have several thousands of colonists settling from Sardinia. A few from the Lerida region, however, participated too, and the latter, let's remember that, was actually under Islamic control. So this is fascinating because you have even demographic migratory dynamics that do not follow they don't go towards a single direction in the frontier. You even have literally Christian populations from Islamic controlled areas that are on the move in these other places. Naturally, I will not digress now on the incredible commixtion of sort of political interest between Muslims and Christians here, how society really was, etc. But it happened as well. As we pointed out before, one interesting aspect of this settlement is that the land had formerly belonged at some point to the fisc, to the public domain. Right, and as long as there had been a public authority of some sort, of course, you couldn't quite simply occupy it. Right. At this point, however, as we've seen, the major external authorities were not there. The local rulers needed these populations, so they invent a mechanism, an institution known as the aprisio, which has to do with the seizure of this land, for which, if you settled and farmed the latter continuously for 30 years, de facto it became your own. They began to form some allodial possessions, in part because there was not even locally a very strong centralized authority, so these people could simply sort of defend that. There were households, they weren't simply peasants in many ways. But the sense was that still coming to live from different backgrounds there would make people freer, at least. The new villages founded were preserved by these rights to some extent. And the interesting aspect is that these communities at a point were essentially moving en bloc from the mountains to the lowlands guided by a priest, with this idea of faith, of guidance, of of a obtaining a promised land, and molding this on the basis of their morality, their spirituality. And there was a fair degree of liberty, as we were saying. Intensive farming starts appearing. There is, however, also a lot of sort of more truly frontier areas where, say, people tended not to invest, right? This mostly happened because of military reasons, right? If there were disputed zones, they tended also to be raided more often than not, and as a consequence, they weren't so hospitable after all. So the territorial picture is complex. There are, again, expeditions, as we've seen, that can come from different places. The Catalan counts are not that, say, peaceful, but just by themselves. But they tend to organize this effort towards a further consolidation locally, and in part also expansion. It was, as we've seen, the dawn of a feudal society fully meant. The castellans began to appear, like there were these free communities that, however, could not quite make it on their own, especially in the affirmation of knighthood. The 10th century is the founding of the militia, for sure. And so gradually these communities were, of course, led, but since the beginning in many ways, by these lords, right, ruling from their castles that formed a broader network, and districts as well on the basis of single fortifications. These were particularly important on the frontier. They weren't just commanding the locals, also protecting from external threats. But remember that in likely most of Europe, encapsulation during the 10th century, made lots of videos about this, was not much to defend from external threats, right? Especially the most important castles were built in the center, in open ground of the most fertile areas, and were meant to subject the local communities. The external threats didn't come all the time. You still needed castles in general for them, but many of, say, other fortresses, because of these external threats, were created ad hoc and eventually abandoned at a time. And the castellans, as such, began to be co-opted by the counts of Catalonia, which was a way to structure further the social hierarchy, and so to give a greater order from top to bottom. And in spite of the autonomy of the same counts, still they acted as lords over these castellans, as the latter acted as lords over the peasantry. The castellans were remunerated by a grant of fiscal land called a fief, so hence you have the counts taking control of that sort of public domain management. So not everything was controlled by the castellans. There were some small peasant holdings that still, lived out there on their own next to the aristocratic domains, but it's obvious that they were gradually eroded. Right? You consider that the aristocratic domains were also fortifying consistently, especially in the second half of the 10th century. Languedoc, that had been freed also from this broader Islamic presence, etc., was rapidly growing, also on the basis of the previous Roman urbanization. They were providing themselves with sort of ever more robust defenses, while the peasantry wasn't that, of course, that affluent, right? Even though in Europe slavery was declining at this point, still there was, especially in this context of frontier, also with the heathen, but and perhaps exactly because of this reason, the corvée that was otherwise pretty known in, say, the broader post-Carolingian Europe was unknown, right? Part of this reason was that certain estate mechanism had remained, also from Roman times to some extent. The towns controlled really large swaths of the peasant population. These were areas where, again, the city was particularly developed. Just let's say central and northern Italy surpassed, right, in terms of political compaction and territorial management, the southern, this Occitania, let's say, or the level of urbanization, and at least in this autonomistic sense, as well, because there would have been southern Italy, but this would have been brought eventually down by the Normans, at least in a political sense. The city was kept down, a feudal monarchy. So you would argue, as we were pointing out before, that if you just count the centuries, the Roman times were not that far away. The system had not changed too much, at least it had obviously changed a lot. But these were some areas of Europe in which evidently the notion that the Dark Ages had brought to an end of Romanity, of the city, wasn't really going to be displayed. Consider that the counts resided in the cities. This is pretty much obvious. This is like in central northern Italy. The military class at large, say that the Occitanian counts are a bit more feudal than the Italian ones, but in terms of military class and what they did, right, there was a striking similarity. So the towns remained the centers for the distribution and display of power. If you think about Toulouse, I made a video on it, you know that perhaps the problem was exactly this. There was too much of a hybrid between a feudal and a communal system, for which a state like in Italy wouldn't be able to develop, because there was too much competition between these two elements, and also probably less potential for city-states in the first place, comparatively. So actually, Catalonia is a quite mixed bunch, just apparently, at least in general, but in practice, the gluing factor, the sort of identitary characteristics of these lands were already sedimenting, right? There was an important feudal dimension as well, as we just said. The cooperation between the lay and ecclesiastical powers especially was a Carolingian legacy that lived on, especially towards what we were talking about before, the development of the papacy in an ever more reformistic and universalistic sense. The same Catalonian elite was sort of comparticipating the monastic reformation that was also taking place in Gaul, as we've seen, even investing abroad there. We've seen it in other videos about, I don't know, Leon Castile, how these Iberian rulers, even very far away, they contributed to the Cluniac reform, importantly enough. In fact, this, especially the Occitanians, contributed dramatically to the Cluniac movement after the foundation of the monastery by William the Pious, and the order spreading, and so this, especially in Aquitania, but also in Catalonia and Septimania. The most important center was Lesat. In 965, its abbot Gary was asked to reform Saint Michael de Cuza, and in 993, from this union, a congregation would develop with five abbeys headed by Gary, that would eventually spread a bit as a Gothic organization across all Languedoc and in Catalonia as well. And this tells you in many ways how sort of cohesive, after all, the local structures were, and how patrimonially these lands were towards the end of the century really compacting in wealth, right? And again, it's there are moderate circumstances, there are developed places, even rich ones, to some important extent, Western Europe, but it's all gradual. There's been a great sort of lack of center, and so the way the lands agglutinate themselves pass through the sum of all of this. This is true also like for also Europe, of course, but remember that here there is, as we've seen, no regional power dominating, and this is really different from many other places. There is not even you see properly a central urban dimension, right? For example, if you look, I made a video that compared exactly during this year Catalonia and Lombardy. Like Lombardy, aside from the fact that it had remained the cradle of an actual kingdom, in spite of the fact that the rulers were from other places. Well, at this point, actually, they had Italic ones still, but was founded exactly in that sense. It had been the heart of a highly civilized and urbanized kingdom based on the very city, administratively speaking. Catalonia wasn't like that, right? The Catalan counties emerged on the foothills of the Pyrenees. They were quite warlike. They were centers, importantly enough, in the lowlands. This had been influenced by the Muslims, but there wasn't, even in the city-countryside relation, quite that cohesion that, for example, existed in Italy, where all the countryside was basically tied to the city. There wasn't another space out there, or where feudal institutions were curbed by the city that easily. There ain't, right? So the 10th century is a very interesting one, because it shows the becoming of political and institutional dimensions that previously did not exist. I mean, at this point, not even the Italian Commune exists, but you can already see the differences outlined for at least the High Middle Ages, most of the Middle Ages later on, before states took over in a more concrete sense, right? So everything is that calibrated. Accidentally, we made at this point, I think, an impressive amount of Catalonian. I keep saying Catalonian, by the way, it's Catalan if you prefer, but just curious to see how many, because we made really lots of stuff about this, but never talk about, I don't know, Galicia, for example. That's what the cycle does, where say historiography is attempted to Catalonia for many reasons. And I'm curious to see, we made 5-6 videos with this, and not all of it is just about Catalonia. Well, it's not that much actually, but it's good that we started with this, and we have to go on because there's really a lot of stuff to dig about these places. In any case, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.